There are two wolves inside you. One wants to jump back in time and build deep histories and spawn plot lines going forward. The other insists on only creating history as you need it for your current story. But which one should you listen to? Well, that depends on what your story needs. Before we dive into the history, plot, and fantasy elements, let's talk about two strategies for creating ancient lore. Welcome to Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. When you're creating ancient lore for a fantasy world, there are two major approaches to consider. In this discussion, we'll explore how to unify these methods and mix elements from both. But first, let's examine each approach in isolation. The first approach is backward world building, where you start by designing the present and then work backward to justify how the present came to be as it is. The second is forward world building, where you begin with the past and build forward, exploring how events unfold naturally until you reach the present, the point where your story takes place. Let's break these down in detail, starting with backward world building, how to design the present first and then develop the past to support it. Backward world building starts with the present state of your world and works in reverse by asking, how did things get this way? This approach is particularly useful if you want your world to be in a specific condition. For example, if magic is highly restricted in your setting, you could work backward to determine what events led to that restriction. Why do people fear magic? How was it brought under control? Were magical restrictions enforced through laws, religious edicts, technological advancements, or enchanted artifacts? By setting key events and assigning dates, you gradually construct the historical foundation that explains your world's current state. So let's break that down into 4 easy steps. Step 1. Define your end goal. Backward world building starts with a clear vision of the present. What kind of society, technology, or political system do you want to portray? Are you building a feudal world, a mercantile economy, or a corporate dystopia? Establishing these key aspects ensures that your historical development supports your setting. Step 2. Identify your key pillars. Once you've determined your world's present state, identify the major elements that define this state. This could include there's the ruins of an ancient empire that still shapes modern geopolitics. Or there's a long-standing corporate rivalry in a dystopian cyberpunk world that determines the flow of your story. Or there's a magical catastrophe that led to strict regulations on magic use, and the ruins of that is still in the world today. Each of these elements needs its own backstory to create a layered and interconnected history. And this step helps prevent one of the biggest pitfalls of backward world building, creating a world that feels too shallow or too artificial. Okay, then step 3, work backward logically. For each key pillar, determine the historical events that led to its current state. If an empire collapsed 300 years ago, what caused its downfall? Was it war, economic decline, internal rebellion, or an external invasion? If magic is restricted today, when did the restrictions begin? Did religious institutions, governments, or rival magical factions enforce these rules? If corporations now control the world, what historical shifts allowed them to overthrow governments? Each of these key developments needs to be grounded in cause and effect. This ensures that your world has logical progression rather than feeling like history that's just arbitrarily designed to justify the present. And then step 4, cross-reference and fill in the gaps. Once you've outlined major historical events for your key pillars, you need to weave them together in a coherent timeline. This step involves cross-referencing different events to ensure they logically interact with each other. For example, if a great empire fell, did its collapse lead to multiple warring states? What happened to those warring states? If a technological breakthrough changed warfare, how did it affect political power structure? If a religious order banned a particular type of magic, how did magical practitioners respond to that ban? Beyond connecting major events, also consider secondary effects. What unintended consequences might have spun off from these historical developments? Filling in these gaps prevents your world from feeling too mechanical and adds more depth to your history. Okay, so why would you choose to do this backward world building? It does offer some real advantages. It gives you story-driven world building. Everything in the world serves the setting and the story, reducing excessive, unnecessary world building. Secondly, fairly obviously, it avoids bloat. Because you only build history that you need, you're less likely to overwhelm yourself or your readers with extraneous details. And lastly, it creates a clear cause and effect framework. Since events are constructed in direct relation to the present, the historical progression is easy for readers to follow. But like with all things, there are some challenges to backward world building and some downsides. Despite its benefits, these are the pitfalls. It can feel artificial. If not handled carefully, history might feel forced into a predetermined outcome rather than evolving naturally. And sometimes it does require revisions. If you reach the middle of book 2 and you realize that you need a different historical event than what you originally planned, you might have to restructure significant parts of your world's history. Backward world building is a powerful tool when used effectively, but as we can see, it does have some pitfalls, and it's not the only approach. So let's explore forward world building, where you build from the ground up. Forward world building involves choosing a starting point in your world's history and developing it over time, advancing through eras, epochs, years, or whatever you choose to define time in your setting. This approach emphasizes organic development, asking, if this happens, what logically follows? It allows technology, civilizations, and magic to evolve naturally rather than being predeterminedly tailored to an outcome. For example, if you start with early agriculture in a world where magic is real or fantasy creatures exist, you would consider how these factors influence societal development. What is the natural outcome of these elements over time? If you have unicorns in your world, what is the natural outcome of having unicorns present in your world, both in its impact on women who have their virtue intact, being able to tame these beasts, and in terms of people being able to ride these beasts potentially? And if you then take that forward in a cultural way, you develop a culture that you can use within your story. Maybe. But, how do you actually go about doing that? So once again, let's break it down into 4 steps. Step 1, choose a key change or origin point. Your world's history begins with a defining moment. Right now, obviously, this is your history that you're documenting, not the full world, right? So the discovery of magic could be a defining moment. The invention of agriculture could be a defining moment. A divine intervention could be a defining moment. The unification of warring tribes into a proto-empire could be a defining moment. From this moment, history begins to unfold naturally. And if you want more insights on how to build an empire, by the way, check out my Life Cycle of an Empire series. Anyway, so once you have this point in time, you can then start building your history. I just feel that I do need to emphasize here that obviously your world might have existed before, etc., etc. It could have been spun out of gas balls like ours is, etc. But the point that you pick to start is the point from which you start counting your history forward. It's not necessarily the actual starting point of your world, it's the point that you pick for divergence, the point where the history that is going to be important to your world starts, and you just pick a point, you define what that point is and what the world looks like, and then work your way forward. Okay, onward to step 2. Advance your history organically. Once your origin point is established, you move forward through time, considering how societies react and adapt. For example, let's say you're creating a world where Athens discovers magic before Macedonia's rise. Instead of being conquered, Athens uses magic to expand its influence, exporting its culture across the Greek world. What happens next? Does this magical Athens prevent the rise of the Roman Empire? Without Rome, does Carthage dominate the Mediterranean? How does Egypt adapt to a magically empowered Greece? What long-term cultural and technological effects arise from this divergence? By working forward, you allow history to develop naturally based on the logical consequences of past events. And that leads us very naturally into step 3, which is introducing conflicts and turning points. History isn't just a straight line. It's shaped by conflicts, disasters, and major turning points. As you advance your history, consider key disruptions. Are there wars? Does Carthage challenge Athens for dominance? Are there plagues? How does a magical society handle disease? Are there industrial revolutions? Does magic accelerate technological advancement or retard it? And what about religious schisms? Does magical power create theological upheaval? These moments create natural points of divergence that shape the world, adding depth and realism to your history. And if you're interested in a deeper dive into historical world building, check out my full video on the topic in the information card. Okay, and finally, we reach step 4, ensure that the past shapes the present. By the time you reach your story setting, your world should feel like a fully realized organic system. However, one key rule of forward world building is that the story must emerge naturally from the world. You can't build an entire history and then slap any story onto it. The narrative should feel like an inevitable product of the world's evolution. Okay, so why choose forward world building? And it does again offer several advantages. It creates a world that feels authentic and lived in. The evolutionary process ensures historical consistency. It also encourages deep exploration of culture, technology, and historical dynamics. The world's development happens naturally rather than being forced into a predetermined structure. And it can lead to surprising discoveries. As you build forward, you may stumble on a compelling story idea that you hadn't considered. You could find yourself thinking, this period, this character is the story I actually want to tell. But of course, there are also challenges. While powerful, it does have drawbacks. You run the risk of the dreaded world builder's disease. Because you're continuously building, it's easy to get lost in endless development and never write the story. Of course, even if you do manage to get to the writing of the story, you could overbuild. Your historical background may become excessively detailed, requiring significant effort to streamline for storytelling purposes. And it can create complications with a planned story. If you already have a story idea, your organic timeline might not naturally fit that story, forcing you to either rework your world or adjust your plot. Before we compare the two approaches, just a quick note. If you love these videos of mine, you will absolutely love my newsletter. It comes out 4 times a year, once every 3 months, and it's packed full of tips and tricks and thoughts and all kinds of deeper ideas around my videos. There are also exclusive giveaways, and you will get to know all about the projects that I'm busy with, both in terms of world building and in terms of my own writing. There's also a question and answer section that you can ask questions, which I will answer in the newsletter, and some of the answers might feature in future videos. So if all that sounds interesting, there is a link to my newsletter down below. It's completely free, so go ahead and sign up for that. Now that we've explored both backward and forward world building, let's examine how you can blend these methods together to create a dynamic, well-structured world that still serves your story. Now, the key to combining these two approaches is to start with your present-day snapshot, as I said. We're starting with our backward world building, right? But we don't define all the detail up front. You only need a high-level understanding of what's essential for your plot. This provides your guiding principle or North Star that ensures that all world-building decisions serve the story. And once again, we'll then break that down into 4 steps. So, define your North Star. This is your core premise, and that could be, for example, you want magic to be outlawed because your protagonist is a member of the Inquisition against mages, and during the story they will discover that they're a mage themselves. This revelation forces them to hide their powers while uncovering the hypocrisy of the institution they once served. With this in mind, you only need to establish the key pillars that make this plot possible. Magic must be outlawed, the Inquisition must exist as a powerful force, the world must have a reason to fear magic. So you need those 3 elements. Everything else, cultures, economies, nations, and the other details, are flexible and they can be built organically. Okay, so once we've got that North Star, we step backward from the present. And we now pick our starting point as though we're forward world building. Maybe we discuss when magic was discovered, or maybe when magic was outlawed, or whatever other element we want to pick. And we bear in mind we have a North Star that we're aiming towards. And then we start building the cultures forward in a forward world building style, while remembering that we need something that outlaws magic. We need something that creates the Inquisition. We need to introduce all of those elements, but we also have all of the other forward world building elements that we build in. Plagues and wars and empires rising and falling and so on. So we're working forward from the origin point to the point of the story, by also building in those key golden threads that we need of how did society react to magic? Did magic maybe spark wars? Did it cause the social upheaval? When did the fear of magic begin? When was the Inquisition created, and what were the causes of it? And that, along with all the normal forward world building, ensures that you keep that natural evolution of magic while still bearing in mind the things that you need for your story to take place, building towards your North Star. So you're not rigidly building backward and only building the events that you need for your current timeline. You're also building all of the rest towards your goal. And then in step 4, once you have your general historical flow, you iterate backward and forward to fine-tune the detail. You make sure that the timeline makes sense. You make sure your key events are logically connected. You make sure that there is enough time for institutions like the Inquisition to become deeply entrenched in the culture. And this iterative process basically just helps you overbuilding, because you don't define the entire timeline, but the parts of the story that matter most. So by blending backward and forward world building, you achieve basically the best of both worlds. It prevents you from overbuilding because you know what you're aiming for. It keeps that present day structured enough to actually tell your story in, but it still allows for natural historical evolution because you're going back in time and building forward toward an aim, but in a natural fashion. And that maintains the flexibility of forward world building. Okay, so this method ensures that your world building serves your story while maintaining depth and authenticity, giving your world a rich historical feel without getting lost in the details. So this is generally how I try to build my world. I try to build my world in both forward and backward ways. I know that I have certain things in mind and I try and build it toward that to serve my story. But personally, I'm a big fan of horses for courses. If you have a really tight story that you want to tell, use backward world building. If you have a vast, expansive world, use forward world building. And if you have a kind of mix of both, mix and match the two together and build your world and its ancient lore in a way that works for your story. But no matter how you build, whether you're building forward or backward or a mix of the two, you'll need to create civilizations that feel real in your ancient lore. How did they rise, thrive, and fall? And that's what we'll cover next time. So don't miss it. And in the meantime, let me know in the comments, which way do you prefer to build your history, forward or backward? And if you want early access to the next episode, consider joining the channel for the price of a cup of coffee a month. Members get a ton of perks like early access, worksheets, live questions and answers, and all kinds of fun things. And a huge shout out to the current high tier members of this channel. In the Build It in Stone level, we have Lupex Lakeshire, Katie Kofi Mug, and Tony Lamanna. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the thumbs up button and check out my video on how my world building process changed over the past years. And I will see you soon for another video from Just in Time World Building.